Change is all around us. We hear that we experience more change now than ever before, and change is almost an ethos at work. Like if something isn't working, let's shake it up. Let's try something new, or let's move towards that shiny object that we see. But if there are problems, are there problems with that approach? What if everything being in constant flux causes more problems than the promise of the change itself? If that idea intrigues you in any way, even if that idea maybe makes you a little bit uneasy, I promise you're in the right place. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you're listening to this podcast, you could join us in the future for live episodes because they all happen live, simulcast across multiple social media channels long before they make it to the podcast. And so by doing that, you could get this information sooner, which could be of great value to you. If you want to learn more about when that's happening and how that's happening, you can join our Facebook or LinkedIn groups to find out how to join us live. And you can do that by going to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. Today's episode is brought to you by our Remarkable Masterclasses. Pick from one of 13 important life or leadership skills to help you become more effective, productive, and confident while overcoming some of a leader's toughest challenges. You can learn more and sign up at remarkablemasterclass.com. Our guest today is Ashley Goodall. He's joining us again. He's been here before. More about that in a minute. Let me introduce him, and then we'll dive in. Ashley Goodall is a leadership expert and author. He has spent his career exploring large organizations from the inside, and most recently as an executive at Cisco. He is the co-author with Marcus Buckingham of 9 Lies About Work, a free thinker's guide to the real world, which is what brought him to be on this podcast before in 2019. He's also the co-author of 2 cover stories for the Harvard Business Review, Reinventing Performance Management and The Feedback Fallacy, which was Harvard Business Review's favorite article in 2019. He's written a great new book that is coming soon. If you're with us live, it's going to be a little while. If you're on the podcast and you're jumping onto the podcast the day this comes out, it's the day before the book comes out. It's called The Problem with Change and the Essential Nature of Human Performance. That will be our conversation focus today. So Ashley, man, I'm so glad to have you back. We had the chance to chat for a couple minutes and kind of catch up before I hit the go live button. So man, I'm glad to have you here. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be back, Kevin. I'm looking forward to this.
So tell us a little bit about the journey, specifically as it relates to why write a book about the problems with change. We'll talk about what those problems are in a little bit, but like, what leads you to write and be thinking about this particular stuff?
It's interesting listening to you name all the things I've written. And there is a little bit of a thread through them, isn't there?
We talked about this too, didn't we?
Lies at Work, The Fallacy of Feedback, and now I'm on The Problem with Change. And so you might sort of, especially if people are reading, I don't know, the hard copy version of our podcast, which doesn't exist, they could read it and go, well, this guy he's a bit of a crank, isn't he? There's always something wrong. There's always something he's poking at. But actually,
he's not cranky at all, everybody. He's just not.
I don't feel cranky today. I feel cheery, boisterous, not boisterous, cheery. But you look at all of that stuff and then you ask about, okay, where does the problem with change come from? I suppose my thing is that I wander around the work world and go, that doesn't make sense. What's hang on a second. Whoa. No, not that. And so with this one, I was spending time in organizations and talking to colleagues in organizations around the world. And the thing I heard over and over and over again was, oh my God, we got another bloody change. This thing's coming down. We've got one of these. There's a reorg. There's a change in leader. I'm on another team. Oh, they've changed the technology. The one that everyone loves to hate. We've redone the office floor plan, and now I can't actually find my colleagues without looking them up somewhere. and I'm surrounded by all these people I don't know who I'm meant to be collaborating with in some way. So
Or I worked at home for 4 years, now I have to come back to that
now I
office.
have to go to the office. And by the way, I worked at home and I was on this piece of technology, but then overnight someone tweets something, so I can't find anything anymore. Um, so I was hearing all these stories from the working world about too much change. And then at the same time, you listen to what leaders say, and indeed what we train leaders to do. And leaders say change is fabulous, disrupt everything, move fast and break things. The more change, the better. We must change. And leaders are taught part of the job of a leader is to make change. So I looked at all of this and said these two things can't both coexist. It can't be that too much change in a way harms people, makes life very, very hard at work, and yet more change makes business better. That doesn't square. So I got curious, and that's what led to the book.
And there's certainly research that says that as an individual, we can only handle so much change at a time. And that's a real thing, and that's not even one of the things you talk about a whole lot in the book, but it's certainly true. So, as I was reading the book and preparing for this conversation, I thought I could have a really good podcast just by reading the introduction, because you make this story, you tell this story that would like everyone would understand, recognize, both smile and shake their head at the same time, like you're doing, and yet that wouldn't be a very compelling podcast, and it wouldn't require you. So we're not going to do that. I'm just going to tell you all, when you get your copy of The Problem with Change, you're going to love the beginning, and then you're going to say, okay, like he gets me. And then you're going to want to keep reading. So one of the things you say early in the book is that life we're experiencing life in the blender. What do you mean by that?
Well, I was just trying to describe this feeling of one thing after another, and not feeling particularly in control of any of the things that was happening, any of the changes. And I don't know. I was listening to people talk with their stories about, oh, now we're doing this. I thought we were doing this. We got halfway into this project, and then it got cancelled, and now we're doing this. And I was on this team last week, but now I've been told I'm going to be on this team, but I don't really know what that team is, and it has a different leader. And then that team's actually going to go off into that organization over there, and this, and this is a big long chain of things, all of which is like, I don't know. It's like being everything's mixed up the whole time. I was like, well, what's a kitchen appliance that mixes things up? It's a blender, isn't it? So we'll call it life in the blender. Um, and then of course it gets a little bit fun, because then you ask yourself, well, who's operating the blender, and what are the names of the buttons that they're pressing? And in a way, the leaders of the organization, I'm sure, not necessarily out of ill will, but the leaders of organizations are pureeing things and chopping things and shredding things, and the
And
rest of
there,
us are stuck in the middle,
as you
being
said,
sort of blended the whole time. So it's a
as you
little,
said, different than the blender in your kitchen, all of the buttons might be being pushed at the same time,
yeah, someone might
which
just
which
mash
you
the
said
whole
as
lot.
well. You said something in passing that's really important, I think, and and that is that they're not intentional. Leaders aren't intentionally trying to do this. They're not mean. They're not villains. And oh, by the way, here's the other paradox that you said it earlier. We teach leaders to put a good spin on change, and when they're talking, senior leaders especially, when they're talking about it always in glowing terms. But when they close their office door, they're feeling all exactly the same things.
I think it's a very important point. There's some interesting stuff that I get into in sort of halfway through the book about what insulates leaders from a real understanding of what goes on, and what happens to somebody when you make them powerful in some way. And stuff happens, and we can research all of that, and we can see that. But that doesn't challenge the point that leaders are trying to do a good job. They are responding to a set of pressures and economic signals in the world, and investor signals, and all of these other things that aren't quite as visible, I don't think, to people on the front lines. But
I think that's very true. I think it's a really important point.
you could call this the problem with change. You could call it the paradox of change. You could call it the tragedy of change, interestingly enough, because, the one definition of a tragedy, I suppose, is bad things happen when everyone's trying to do good things. And that's sort of what's going on here. So what I'm trying to do is just shine a light on this so that when a leader, say, comes into a new job or a new organization, and every time in their career before in that circumstance, they've gone, all right, well, let's pull up the org chart. All right, let's start shifting that around, and bring me the strategy, and we'll have a new one of those. And I'm going to change out half the people on the leadership team, and then we're going to do that all the way through the organization. That somewhere in the back of their head, we'll have a little thought that goes, hang on a second, hang on a second. If I solve for change, I might not solve for performance. And actually, I was sent here to solve for performance. So how does that occur?
Yep. You know what is an interesting? I didn't even know I was going to share this, but I think it's exactly what I should share right now. Um, in our work with new and frontline leaders, from our book From Bud to Boss, so we do lots of work with new and frontline leaders. In fact, I had this conversation with a group virtually this morning. And the question that we ask is, what are the common mistakes that new leaders make? And we always frame it. New could be brand new. I've never done this before, but also I'm a new leader. I'm new to this group, which is what you
Mhm.
just described, right?
Yeah.
I've been a leader, but I'm new to this group. And you know what? One of the single biggest, most common mistakes we hear is too much change too fast. Not necessarily, they're not necessarily saying change is bad. They're just saying they're changing it before they even know what the heck's going on right now. And you just described what happens is we feel like we're supposed to, we feel like we're tasked with it, and we're doing it before we even know the ground we're walking on. You want to comment on that?
Well, and yeah, I mean, I think people feel that they were hired to put their imprint on something. I've certainly had that feeling in my career. They brought me in to make my mark on this thing.
I better
And,
prove that I was worthy of the selection.
what, if I don't take up a chisel and a mallet and hit a rock, I'm not going to leave my mark, am I? So I'd better get whacking away at it, because otherwise my mark won't be left. Um, and so one of the most important messages that I think we've got to get across to people is change and improvement are not the same thing. And so we've actually got to start by thinking about, where does improvement come from? Um, and more improvement comes from not the leader than we leaders are probably comfortable admitting to.
We're not
Improvement,
the ones
lots
doing the
of
work.
improvement comes from the people who do the work, people on the ground, people on the front lines. And so you actually have to, like, rewire your thinking about organizational performance and improvement to go, where's it come from? Front lines mainly. What conditions do we need to create on the front lines to enable improvement to emerge? And very high on the list of conditions is stability. Not stasis, stability, but certainly not life in the blender. Life in the blender doesn't help anybody do very much of anything.
Except wait and wonder and be anxious. So here's another exercise that I do with leaders all the time. I'll ask them. I'll short circuit this, but basically, I ask people, write down what your thoughts are about change. And by the way, about half of the things we get aren't thoughts; they're feelings. If we were playing Family Feud, the number one answers are all feelings. Some of them are positive, some of them aren't. But here's the interesting thing. Um, uh, it comes down in many cases to I say, are they positive, are they negative, or are they neutral? And all of the neutral ones somehow form around this idea of uncertainty. And I want us to get to uncertainty in a minute, because I just don't know. And if they say, well, if I said, well, what if I use the word progress? Well, then all my words will be positive, because you can look up change in the thesaurus, and progress will be one of the synonyms. But progress implies change for the
Better.
better. But change itself, we don't know. We don't know. Right? We don't know. I want to get to it. I want to get to uncertainty, but we got to unpack something else first. And that is, like, how did we end up here? Like, how did we end up with this idea that somehow disruption is good and is maybe even necessary or essential? Like, how did we get, because it hasn't always been that way.
No, I mean, I think, that we can debate the history of this. I think a pretty good starting point, if you're looking for a beginning of all of this stuff, You're going to be fairly close to the mark if you say Clay Christensen, The Innovator's Dilemma, which was published in the 90s, I think,
Yep.
towards the end of the 90s. And Clay Christensen, Harvard professor, very, very smart guy, said, I've studied some industries, and here's what happens. The leaders in those industries, in the established industries, face a certain set of economic incentives. And they've got customers, and the customers like the products at a certain price point. So they've got a certain profit margin that they have to ensure, and they've got stakeholders and whatever. So they don't have many degrees of freedom. And so what happens is a little startup will come along and basically eat their lunch, because a little startup's got a different source of capital. Its customers aren't necessarily expecting something to be cheap at the very beginning. Think Tesla, for goodness sake. When Tesla was tiny, Tesla was selling modified Lotus cars for hundreds of thousands of dollars to like 5 people. And they didn't have to deal with GM's profit margins or Tesla today profit margins. They could be an upstart. So Clay Christensen observes all of this and says, look, by doing the right thing by your customers, leaders of large organizations are going to lose their businesses. This would be a problem. And he's completely right. But then you get to what's the solution? And of course, his prescription is take some people out of your workforce, put them in a room off on one side, like the Skunk Works
I was gonna
concept.
say, so that idea
And
comes from the mid '80s with Tom
right, with
Peters and
Rocky
Bob
Mountain.
Waterman.
And they will invent the disruptive, here we go, product, and you can then bring it back into your business. And now they've created a new market and a new product and a new economic structure for that product. And so, hallelujah, you've done it. And a lot of people listen to everything I've explained now and said, disrupt everything then. Oh, off we go, which was
But
a
that's not what
massive,
he
that's not what
said,
he said.
but
It was
that's
a
where
massive
we went.
misunderstanding. And it's like stuff goes bad in human affairs when we turn complicated ideas into taglines. And this got turned into a tagline. And then all of a sudden, disruption is like the only idea, not one of the 3 ideas about how to run a business, the only idea. We must run businesses by creating constant churn across the board. And if we don't do so, we're failing. And that's sort of where it comes from. 20 years we've been
And
living
so
in.
for 20 years, we've been teaching NBA students that,
Yes.
and we've been writing about it and all this other stuff. So I think I think
Now,
that
did
that's
you know
fair.
the irony in the story? His prescription, Clay Christensen's original prescription, take people away and wall them off from corporate everything.
Yeah,
He's creating stability. That's not what
yeah.
he's doing for the people who are going to be making the brand new products. The thing he's recommending is remove them from life in the blender. They get life in the whatever anti-blender thing is. Life in the cozy, warm space where things are predictable and you're in control. You have a great degree of certainty about what's going to happen next. You are together in a community of people. You have a good sense of belonging. You're in a particular place and your work is massively meaningful. That's like the absolute epitome of innovation producing stability, but it gets branded disruption and foisted on everybody as something very different from the thing that Clay started with.
So um, the front half of the book is about the problem, and you identify several things, and we're not going to get to all of them. We're only going to talk about one of them, and I already brought it up, and that's uncertainty. A bunch of reasons why I'm picking that one doesn't really matter, but let's talk about the problem of uncertainty. We've already hinted at it. What are the problems, and why is this a huge culprit to the overall problem that we're talking about?
Um, the problem with uncertainty is it fries people's brains, roughly speaking, um, and more so than inflicting pain on people. So the science on this is all a little bit weird when you sit and read it, because it almost all involves giving people electric shocks. And when I started, I'm like, has anyone ever had another thought in uncertainty research than wiring people up and shocking them? And the answer is apparently not. Um, But anyway, what's nice about an electric shock is you can use it to measure pain, but also the gaps in between the electric shocks you can use to create uncertainty. And so there's this one experiment where they give one group of people a bunch of really strong electric shocks, and then a different group of people a mixture of strong electric shocks and moderate electric shocks, and they measure the stress levels. And it's less stressful to be given consistent high shocks than it is for it to go up and down. The group that got 3 strong electric shocks and 17 medium ones was much more stressed than the people who just got high level electric shocks the whole time. Then somebody else much more recently did a very clever experiment involving a computer game involving a snake and some electric shocks, I believe. They're probably a little bit of both. And what they were measuring is the moments of highest stress. And the moments of highest stress for people who were uncovering, I think, snakes in a simulated environment, or being shocked, or both. The moment of highest stress was when their uncertainty was at its highest, not when their pain was at its highest. So uncertainty trumps pain. This is a very, very important thing to understand if you're in a workplace, because workplaces actually, most of them don't create much pain. They create a hell of a lot of uncertainty. And
So
you
you
can,
made it. So if I want to move us on a little bit because you make a point that I think I'm glad you shared that with us, and that point of and if all you all take from this is uncertainty trumps pain, then this was worth the 30 minutes that you spend with us. But you talk about something else that's really important: the difference between uncertainty and fear.
well, the way to think about this is it's actually the example is from Marty Seligman, who writes about this in his book Helplessness, which
Okay.
is another, by the way, if you like reading about electric shocks, then go read about helplessness, and it's about helplessness and depression and a lot of other very, very cheerful topics. But it is a masterpiece, and it is a classic of the psychological literature. So if you want to understand human beings, Marty Seligman, Helplessness, you should read that. And he gives the example of a rabid dog, and he says, well, you might be afraid of a rabid dog because you know that if it bites you, bad things are going to follow. But the thing is, when it leaves, the threat is gone, and you can deal with that. People can deal with that. The problem is that uncertainty doesn't have an end. You
I
can't
don't know if the dog is still here or not.
because there wasn't a dog. There was just there's a reorg coming. And the reorg coming exists for a long time before there's an end. And by the way we do reorgs at work, by the way, is when we finish one, we start the next one. So there really is no end to all of this stuff in the world of work. And so Seligman says, look, there's a difference between fear and chronic anxiety. And chronic anxiety is the flavor of uncertainty that these other experiments look at. And what you need in a world of rabid dogs and chronic anxiety is a thing called a safety signal. And the safety signal is the psychological equivalent of the dog left. And it's to say, we're done now. We're done now. It's okay. You can breathe out. The thing has passed. And what you see when you look at particularly executive communications or leadership communications in organizations is a whole bunch of people trying to come up with a safety signal when there isn't a believable one. This won't be too bad. We'll be through it soon. This is for all the right interests. We're sad that thousands of people have got to leave us, but we'll
But
be done with this. But. And it's all like reaching for safety signals. But there aren't safety signals for a lot of things at work. And so when you start down the path of uncertainty, you are creating an environment that is very psychologically toxic for people. And once you've started, you can't actually do very much about it. It's very hard to come up with a credible and persuasive and believable way of letting people know that we're through it now.
and hear this clearly, everybody. Even if you really are, if you really can show them that we're done, they may not believe you because and their perception is what matters here. So even it's excuse me, it's super hard, as Ashley's saying, and it almost doesn't matter because we don't believe it because we've lived 67 times when it wasn't true. They don't think you're lying necessarily, but they don't really believe you.
Or they don't, or people are smart. I mean, the other thing about organizational life is people are very smart and very astute readers of organizational signaling. And so people can look at a leader and go, you're telling me it's all going to be safe, but you actually don't control whether it's going to be okay or not.
Right.
You can't unilaterally make it all okay because I know what got us into this in the first place. And
It
it was
wasn't you.
partly your doing and partly not your doing, and you don't control everything. So, and then, by the way, and this is, it gets even more strained and strange because then the disassociation between what the leader is saying and what the people understand to be the reality on the ground makes the uncertainty worse. So now you're in this sort of spiral. And, it makes it hard to show up in the morning and get on with your job, which ultimately is what we're talking about in all of these things. What are the conditions for somebody to do a good job? Uncertainty is not one of them.
So you wrote something in the book, and it literally made me laugh out loud when I read it, because you don't just talk about uncertainty. We talk about four other reasons why the way we're doing it, based on the way we see the world, is causing us problems. And then you say in the book, but Blockbuster, it makes me laugh. But my point is, we all know when we say that, like if you're old enough to know what Blockbuster was, like sometimes we really do have to change. So my question is, in the few minutes we have left, like what do we do? Like we can rethink all this, and yet sometimes, what do we do? Yes, I think there are some things we can do to reduce and change and all those things we've talked about. But what are a couple of tangible things that leaders can do, especially if you're a leader somewhere inside the organization?
Yeah.
You're a frontline leader, you're a leader of leaders, you're in the middle. Like, what can you do now that you've preached the gloom and doom, Ashley?
You want me to cheer you up now?
Yeah, let's try.
Teams are beautiful things. Teams are beautiful things. Teams, if you want a simple way of thinking about this as a leader, imagine yourself primarily as a leader of a team. And that team, in the relationship between the people on the team, provides for itself a great sense of certainty, social glue. We talk a lot about meaningful work. Meaningful work at an organizational level is much more slideware and slogan than it is actually tangible meaning for humans. But work on a team is massively meaningful because I know what my work is. And if my team understands that, then I can begin to amplify that meaning out and up in an organization.
And
Um,
I know that when I do this, it helps
it helps.
Jill.
And they can tell me. So if you want the place where stability needs to live in organizations, is teams, which means we've got to help team leaders learn that this is part of their job, is to create stability for people. We've got to help team leaders lead in a way that creates stability. So the quick thought on this is if you're micromanaging somebody, that's not it. If you are making space for them to establish their own agency, then that is it. You're much closer to the mark there. If you are talking in strange corporate lingo that nobody really understands and they don't sort of really figure out what is, am I being sold something here? Is this a fake safety signal? Where's the rabid dog? Blah, 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 blah. If you're doing all of that, you're not helping. If you're speaking real words that actual humans use to communicate with one another when they're not at work, we all know what those words are. We'll call them real words. Then you're doing pretty well. And if you are thinking about at work, what are the rituals that teams can participate in? What is the weekly this? What is the daily this? What is the set of whenever this happens, we do this? What are the responsive rituals? What are the things that give predictability to time and predictability to a group of people working together. If you do those things, you're off to a pretty good start.
Creating a rhythm, you're building that stuff into culture, you're doing all that stuff. So be predictable, speak real words, honor ritual, most of all, focus on your team. So Ashley, is there anything else? I mean, this wasn't meant to be a book report. You and I talked about that before we started as well. In fact, I'm hoping that everybody wants to go out and get their own copy of The Problem with Change and the Essential Nature of Human Performance. But is there anything we didn't talk about that you really think we should have highlighted, or you wish I would have asked?
I think where I arrived at the end of all of this research and all this writing, is the idea that actually we sort of think of organizations in an upside down way. We think of the point of organizations as being economic profit or economic activity or customer this or customer that. But actually, the right way to think of an organization is to think of it as a platform for human contribution. And that if you can understand that we all have choices of where to work, we all have things to offer to the world, and yet there are many things that we can't do by ourselves that are deeply intrinsically rewarding for us to do. And to do those things, we need to team up with other people. And then the sky's the limit. At least it has been so far in human history. So our organizations, our large companies, our other organizations are there to allow us to amplify what each of us brings to the world. And we need to think of them in that way, because then that will help us put the humans back in the middle. You get that right, a lot of other goodies come along. You get a lot of happy customers, you got a lot of economic upside. But if you aren't thinking of human organizations around the humans, then you're missing out.
Organization is an organism, not a mechanical thing. I'm
Exactly.
just saying what you said in a less elegant way. I love that, and that's a pretty good place for us to shift gears to the final part of our conversation, Ashley. So tell us what you do for fun.
I like to play golf in the summer. Can't do it here in the Northeast in the winter because it's a little white ball and you lose it in the snow. But I like to play golf for fun, and that's my thing. I still play the piano a little bit, but not so much these days. But golf is interesting because it's an exercise in frustration, as anyone who plays golf knows, and it's also an exercise in learning in a very different way. And it is fascinating to me how hard it is to learn something by feel rather than by sort of intellectual learning, which is the sort of learning I've done for most of my life. But somebody says hit a golf ball and you say show me, and they show you, and then go do that. You can't do that because you don't know what it feels like on the inside. And there is, I think, in that a profound truth about how to help other people learn, which is they have to help themselves feel what it's like to do the thing that we're trying to help them be better at.
Because learning isn't knowledge. Learning is there is intellectual knowledge is learning, but learning is about doing it, which means I have to pick up
You got to know your way to do it.
and I got to pick up the club and I got to hit the keys. So here's my observation for you. Take this for what it's worth, Ashley. If I remember right from our first conversation, that you have a degree in music. Do I
That's
remember
right.
that correctly?
Yeah.
So you play the piano. So you started out learning things by
In a
feel,
tactile way, yeah.
and now you're back to learning things by feel. How about that for an observation?
Yeah, and how great is that? And how back to the theme of uncertainty and stress, how de-stressing is that? Because it puts your brain in a sort of changes the channel on your brain a little bit, and there's something lovely and rejuvenating about that. Even when you can't do it very well, which is my golf game.
There you go. So you did something this weekend that I need to do badly, and if anyone on my the people on my team that watch or listen to this are going to spit out their coffee when they hear this, you have just reorganized your bookshelves, and my team would say, Kevin, well, first of all, you need more of them, but that's a problem that you've got, Kevin. I have not doing that. I haven't done it. You've done it. And as a result of that, you've got new things on your reading list. So tell us what you're reading right now.
The one I just started, like yesterday, day before, is a book named Smart Swarms, and it's been around a little while, but it's about emergence. And having just described an organization in terms of A, an organism, and B, a thing where performance emerges from a group of people helping one another, supporting one another, providing a sense of belonging for one another. It's not massively difficult to see why I might find reading about ants interesting. But so far, I've read the beginning of the book, and it's all about ants. And my God, they're fascinating ants. I mean, I always knew they were interesting. There was some clever stuff going on there. But, there's a big description of how they know whether there's a threat or how do they know whether there's food based on how quickly the morning foragers come back. If they come back in a big rush, that's a bad signal. If they come back very slowly, also bad, no food. But if they come back in a sort of moderate way, presumably smiling in a sort of anti way, then that's lovely news. And hey, that means there's food. And
Let's go.
so that's how a decision is made with no person making or no ant making the decision. The decision is emergent, and I think this, it's an idea that's been around for a while, but I think it has profound implications for how we think about work, and again, how we think about teams and how we think about organizations.
Smart Swarms. But the other book that you would like them all to read is your new book, The Problem with Change. Ashley, where do you want to point people? Where can they learn more about you, learn about the work, et cetera, et cetera?
So learn about me on my website, ashleygoodall.com, which is exactly as it sounds. And you can get the book wherever books are sold, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all of the other outlets where people go book shopping.
Ashley, thank you for joining us today. I've been looking forward to it because I know how much I enjoyed our first conversation. And by the way, everybody, I'll put a link to the first conversation in the show notes, as we always do. Put a couple of other episodes that you might find interesting, but we'll for sure put Ashley's there, the 9 lies about work, and you'll have that there. But I have a question for all of you that I ask you every week before we wrap up. And the question is simply this: now what? What action will you take because of this? And I'm not just talking about buying a book, although I hope you do that. And I'm not just talking about you encouraging someone else to listen to this, although I hope you do that. I'm really asking you to think about what action will you take based on what you just listened to? What action will you take? Maybe you need to think about how you can be more predictable with your team. Maybe you need to think about how to focus on your team more. Maybe you're going to rethink uncertainty. Maybe you're going to work harder to find a credible and believable safety signal. I don't know what that is for you, but I do know that if you take action on what you got here, you'll have far more value from it than just having listened. I do hope that you found it useful, but it will only be ultimately useful if you take action. Ashley, thanks again for being here. Such a pleasure to have you back. We might have to do another one before there's another book. We just might have to do that. And so everybody, I hope that you will come back next week, because I'll be back next week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Make sure wherever you're listening that you go, say that you like it, share it with somebody else. You know how to do all that stuff. But I just hope you'll come back and join us for another episode, because we'll be back next week. We'll see you then.